Michael, you are the Biden expert here. What stuck out to you today?
Well, Stephanie, we've been reporting that since Donald Trump's criminal conviction last week, part of the White House strategy going forward is to highlight the stature gap between the commander-in-chief, the sitting president, who they believe has a strong record of accomplishment, and yes, a convicted felon who is running a campaign that is more basement than what they think Joe Biden did 4 years ago in the middle of a pandemic. And there is no more uniquely presidential moment than a sitting president going to Normandy, one of the sites of the most significant allied American example of heroism and bravery, and surrounding himself with those heroes in addition to world leaders than this. We saw Donald Trump today speaking to some World War II veterans by Skype from his plane. So that's one thing that stands out as part of the campaign strategy. But I think it's more than just symbolism. The message that the president was able to deliver, drawing on that moment in history to highlight a very real present day challenge. The fact that it's hard to imagine talking about it in this way, but that democracy really is still on the line today, just as it was 80 years ago. And the president's going to build on that. The political message was not lost in that speech today, but it's going to be hit even harder, I'm told, tomorrow.
Nayyera, what did you think of that speech? To Michael's point, you heard the president over and over sort of warning about how vulnerable democracy is.
Well, we've certainly seen that vulnerability here in the United States based on what we're seeing coming up this next election, what we experienced on January 6th a few short years ago. And it was such a contrast in character between President Biden as commander-in-chief right now and when President Trump had that same role as commander-in-chief, who avoided visiting any grave sites with World War II veterans, in fact, calling them losers and suckers because they died in war. I mean, it still boggles the mind that somebody who is responsible for whether or not the United States is going to war would treat veterans in that manner, and treat veterans in that manner while in Europe.
All right, Luke, you get the tough one. Solve this puzzle. Republican Minority Leader Mitch McConnell wrote an op-ed today that seemed in many instances similar to the president's speech. He was tying D-Day to the present day, and he very clearly denounced isolationism. This was the head scratcher for me, because I would like you to remind our audience of where Donald Trump and the majority of the GOP stand on isolationism right now.
Right. Well, Mitch McConnell is in a, I would say, diminishing position within the Senate, and he knows that. And, you know, I spoke with him recently about this very issue, and he says the final years of his life in public office will be to try to bring the Republican Party back away from isolationism. He believes he wants to try to remake it back into the party of Ronald Reagan, and he wants to fight against the Trumpian impulse to, you know, have this sort of isolationist mentality where they reject aid to Ukraine, they reject NATO, and they reject helping our European allies. You know, and I think President Biden's speech tapped into that today, right? He was appealing in some ways to those sort of traditional Republicans who joined the party because of Ronald Reagan, because they wanted to see strength abroad. And he is trying to hold himself out there as their candidate, not Trump, but the traditional Republican candidate in some ways on foreign policy.
But Luke, what traditional Republicans? Mitch McConnell may have a diminishing role. He may be leaving the Senate, so he has the chance to speak his mind. But the idea that he wants to bring back that Republican Party, he's voting for Donald Trump. He has said it publicly.
Yeah, I mean, look, Mitch McConnell's a political animal. He knows that in order to stay in a leadership position, which he's in currently in the Senate, he has to support Donald Trump. Anybody who talks with him privately knows he doesn't really like having to do that. He hasn't spoken to Trump since since December 14th, 2020, when Donald Trump refused to concede the election to Joe Biden after the Electoral College had certified it. So look, I'm not going to say that Mitch McConnell is the paragon of consistency, and he's definitely trying to have both sides. But I do think his core is with the foreign policy wing of the party and not with the isolationist wing.
Of course, it doesn't actually matter what he says privately or what he feels in his heart or what he thinks in his head when he holds public office. Mike, the president's speech tomorrow is also going to echo Ronald Reagan again, but specifically the speech Reagan gave 40 years ago. Are you surprised at all by this effort to sort of tie himself to a Republican president, kind of a Republican icon?
Well, this is not necessarily something that used to be about one party or another. A president, draping himself in patriotic colors used to be par for the course for presidents in both parties. It's really a mark of where we are in our politics that this is seen as maybe a play to Republicans. But that's really what the president sees as an opportunity here. Is he did an interview with ABC News tonight where he talked about how he's preparing for a debate against Donald Trump. And he really summed it up in a new way that we haven't heard before, that Donald Trump is all about himself and I'm for the country. That contrast of a president who is not motivated by his own self-interest, but by the country's interests, is something that we're going to be hearing quite a bit more from the campaign. And it speaks to the strategy of eventually, he still has some work to do, Steph, to build back the base of his party, especially with the situation in Israel and Gaza at the moment. But there is an opportunity going forward to reach out to those Republicans. The primaries may have effectively ended in March, but the Biden campaign has been studying every primary election since then, where Nikki Haley is still getting 10, 15, 20% of the vote, who those voters are, what kind of messages they appeal to. And tonight, during the NBA Finals, President Biden's campaign also launched an ad campaign draped by the flag. The flag is literally the point of the ad, and that really speaks to the fact that patriotism is now something Democrats think that they can run on.
Well, it's a patriot, and patriotism is the word that Republicans have seemed to hijack over the last decade or so. And you're seeing Democratic lawmakers like Wes Moore be insistent that they want to take that term back because it doesn't belong to a party. It belongs to America. Naima, the president is also expected to meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky tomorrow. We know that there are tensions over the pace of U.S. military aid. When you think about the priorities for Ukraine in this meeting, I know it's so important for President Zelensky to just stay in our focus, get media attention, be sure that his war isn't being forgotten.
Well, and his war is up against Russia, which is not an accident that the idea of a country invading another, trying to change borders at its own discretion, which is what happened in World War II, is what we're talking about in the moment with Ukraine. The Reagan aspect is also another parallel. Russia, that was the adversary for Reagan, Cold War era politics. And so tapping into that spirit, not only of the greatest generation of standing up for democracy and for rule of law, but also for standing up against Russia, is going to be a sharp contrast between the Republican Party today that effectively is arguing Kremlin talking points and the fact that the United States and NATO is standing up for a democracy in Europe that needs U.S. weapons, U.S. support every day to take the fight to Russia.
President Biden is going all in to win over Never Trump Republicans. His campaign has officially launched a new effort to court Republicans who have no interest in backing the former president, including those who voted for Nikki Haley, because she may now bring them over to Trump's side. The Biden campaign's outreach will be led by a former staffer to ex-GOP Congressman and Trump critic Adam Kinzinger, who served on the January 6th committee. That is extraordinary. So let's talk about this with former Democratic New York Congressman Max Rose and Amanda Carpenter, writer and editor for Protect Democracy and a former senior staffer to Republican Senators Jim DeMint and Ted Cruz. Amanda, this is super interesting. Is this challenge for this group to convince these voters that they're not just voting against Trump, but that they're voting for Joe Biden, who's going to do things for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's the trickiest thing here. How do you convince Republican voters that they can still be a Republican and retain that Republican identity and vote for Biden in these extraordinary times? And I know there's a lot of smart, enthusiastic Republicans that have been waiting for Biden to do this. They're kind of finally like, okay, now you're calling, finally, this is good. But I actually think the kind of slow warm up, the long getting to know you is actually pretty smart, because what the Biden campaign can do is invite these people to be a part of the process. I actually think that highlighting the disagreements that they may have is the secret to this sauce, because a lot of Republicans feel politically homeless. Donald Trump makes it very hard to support him. So if a lot of Haley voters can get to a place and say, you know what, even though I disagree with Biden on things, I know I will be heard. I know I will be respected, and we can find some core priorities to work together on. I think that's a winning formula.
But Nikki Haley doesn't feel that way. Donald Trump disrespected her right, left, and center, and she's backing him. But he doesn't seem to be spending any time courting those voters or even showing appreciation to her. Does he just assume those voters will be on board with him?
Absolutely. Look, Donald Trump has always run a base-first campaign, right, where he is constantly seeking to rev up this vengeance-first, MAGA always contingent. And that's why he is actually consistently, since 2016, that movement has lost elections. Now, yes, Nikki Haley said she was voting for Donald Trump, but that she hasn't offered resounding support. She hasn't done the Tim Scott cheerleader moment like all these other folks who Trump vanquished in the primary and now have become sycophants. And that's because I do think she understands where those supporters are of her, former campaign. They want nothing to do with Trump because they are actually value voters. They're just value voters who are thinking about things like our democracy. They're value voters that are thinking about respect for our judicial system. They're value voters who actually really truly respect the fact that even when the president's son is facing prosecution, he says, I trust our judicial system, I value law and order, and even when I see my son suffering at the hands of a system, I still believe it, I still put the country first.
He said he wouldn't pardon his own son, and Trump has floated out there that he would pardon insurrectionists.
This is the clearest juxtaposition of where these two men stand in regards to service and the country. For all those parents out there, everyone knows that you would much rather someone go after you than your kid.
Oh, my God.
Right? And so here, even when Donald Trump has been not just prosecuted, indicted, but convicted, he seeks to throw the whole judicial system under the bus, the very fabric of law and order. But President Biden, when his son is facing charges, when his son is going through a court case,
his only living son,
stands back and says, our system matters, and I believe in our system of law and order, even when it's his son. That clearly shows you that President Biden puts the country first and is a patriot, and Donald Trump only cares about himself.
Amanda, what does it say about Donald Trump that, given the stronghold Nikki Haley has over this specific group of voters, wouldn't it seem obvious that she should be his top VP pick, but she's not? What does that tell you about him?
I actually sort of have a little bit of a different perspective on who the Nikki Haley voter is, because to me, I'm not sure that she actually truly represented the movement that was behind her, because there are a lot of Haley voters that simply saw her as a vehicle to express their anti-Trump opposition. Nikki Haley never actually recognized that during her campaign, because I think she is trying to preserve a place in the MAGA Republican Party, even though they've made it entirely clear that she doesn't have a place there. And so that's that's the problem that I think Biden has an opportunity to address, right? Unless you buy into all of the lawlessness, all of the January 6th revisionist history, etc., you don't have a place in Trump's Republican Party. That is why, if you recall, he essentially said that Nikki Haley's barred from MAGA. She made T-shirts at the time, bragging up that a lot of her supporters bought those T-shirts because they understood how they were being pushed out. and they didn't have a place there anymore. Nikki Haley's decision to vote for Trump is confusing, quite frankly, to a lot of her voters. Sure, there's some people that will go along with it, but I think there's a lot more tension there because she never actually had a movement behind her.